Now let me bring in Hopewell. Hopewell, how are you, my brother? Good to see you here and listen from you.
Thank you very much, Kennedy, and everyone who's here listening. I'm learning a lot by just listening. My contribution
Hmm.
is very small.
Go ahead.
Um, I think uh, it's unfortunate that our Zimbabwean brother was killed or murdered in South Africa. I think it's a indictment on many levels, and specifically on leadership levels within the region. I think there are foundational issues that we must tackle. Most of the issues that are happening, people shouting at each other, calling each other names every day, these are symptoms of the foundational issues. And the main issue here is economic. Um, Zimbabwe, I think the South African brother who spoke before the doctor mentioned that by proximity, Zimbabwe is next door to South Africa. That's why you find the issue is mainly becoming Zimbabwe or South Africa versus Zimbabwe. But we need to ask ourselves questions. So the first question I'll ask is, why is it's South Africa versus Zimbabwe and not South Africa versus Botswana or South Africa versus Namibia? It is because of the structural problems in those countries like Zimbabwe. The issue of immigration, people going to South Africa for jobs, it has been going on for over 50 years. And most of these people went there undocumented. But it was never an issue at that point in time because the South African economy could carry that burden. It needed those people to come and work in mines. I think most Zimbabweans would have heard of uncles who went to Wenera working in mines. And the economies of those countries that are now perceived to be a burden to South Africa, like Mozambique and Zimbabwe, were not in the terrible shape in which they find themselves today. So the numbers might have been different. I'm sure that economists and statisticians are able to articulate on those issues. So the number one or the fundamental issue is about our economies. If you go back to the 1950s, 60s, there was a discussion that took place whether it should be dealt with at a continental level by Nkrumah, and Nyerere said it must be dealt with at a regional level, and Nyerere's argument won the day. So if we are talking about regional, let's talk about SADC, for instance. Do we have economic growth um, which is moving at the same pace across the region? The answer is no. Zimbabwe today is a dead economy. South Africa has been thriving for a long time, but because of other issues which are political, the economy has not been performing as it used to. So you find these economic stresses. So if you look at the issue of social services that have been brought up, social services mainly affect the poor. So you find that the Home Affairs Minister of South Africa gave a statistic a couple of months ago where he said 75% of women giving birth at Musina Hospital are from Zimbabwe. The reason why it's like that is because Zimbabwe is not invested in its healthcare system. So naturally, uh, poor South Africans who are affected by this disproportionate movement will make noise about it. Politicians who are perhaps failing to address the issue will end up supporting vigilante groups and so forth. But I don't want to focus on vigilante groups or focus on pressure groups like Dudula, because these are just a symptom of a structural problem, of a foundational problem that has been ongoing for a long time, but that hasn't been taken care of by the leaders. So I think the most important thing is to accept that when we talk about Pan-Africanism, we shouldn't talk about Pan-Africanism in rhetoric terms. Of course, it's good to have a Pan-African continent, but is it possible to have a Pan-African continent when the economies are disproportionate to each other? The answer is no. You can't have it. It's easier for somebody who is in France to go to Italy, to go to Geneva, as the Zimbabwean brother who once talked about. It's because the economies are sort of balanced. But do we have balanced economies in SADC? No, we don't have. And that's, again, that is a political problem that must be addressed. I think as Zimbabweans, we must not just talk of how other countries are doing it without looking at why they've been able to do that. The other countries that we talk of in Europe, they've also had those problems, but they've had leadership that was able to address them. I remember 20 years ago, there was a problem in Britain. The Brits were complaining every day on radio, as the South Africans are doing now. The Brits were complaining about the Polish, because the Polish were able to come into Britain and take jobs and not demand higher salaries. They were able to do so because they were coming from an economy which was much smaller than Britain, and whatever they were paid by the industrialists in building was sufficient for them. But it was not sufficient for a British citizen to take a building job and compete with someone who's ready to take a lower wage. And that has been happening in South Africa as well. The restaurant jobs that we say South Africans are not ready to take, it's because of the salaries that are being offered. South Africans are having to compete with people from Mozambique, with people from Zimbabwe that are ready to take lower wages. And South Africans are correct in saying that the foreigners that are coming into the country, mainly undocumented, are undermining wage negotiations. That is a fact. So I think the question is, what are we going to do about it? Dr. Wole spoke about the issue of South Africans working in other countries. Of course, every African country has got a South African working there, but the circumstances are different. The South Africans would ask you, if we have Zimbabweans, or rather, if we have South Africans who are working in Zimbabwe, are they putting the same pressure on the social services in Zimbabwe that Zimbabweans are putting on the South African economy? The answer is no. So I'm not an expert on this, but I think the most important thing that we must acknowledge, if we are going to be able to solve these issues, is that the problem starts from Zimbabwe. We need to fix our economy. We need to invest in our social services. If we do invest in our social services, we will not have 75% of people at Musina coming from Zimbabwe to give birth. And I've spoken about this, Kennedy, on so many occasions, including last week in Geneva. When I said that the biggest hospital in Zimbabwe only has one maternity theater that is working, which was built in 1977. In total, it has two theaters. The other one is not working. So that is why Zimbabweans are going to South Africa. So if Zimbabwe is able to fix its maternity theaters, we will not have South Africans complaining, saying that Zimbabweans are coming to give birth and giving, or rather putting a huge burden on our social services. So I think we need to look at why the things are the way they are today and ask ourselves if we are able to have a leadership that is able to fix these problems. Would South Africans still complain when these problems have been fixed? I think the answer is no, because there will be no reason for me to go and seek health services in South Africa if health services are working in Zimbabwe. And if health services are working in Zimbabwe, then we can start having a normal conversation about Pan-African behavior between South Africa and Zimbabwe. Because I'm able to go to South Africa as a tourist and they will happily welcome me. I'll spend my 2 weeks in South Africa and go back to my job in Zimbabwe. And I would expect South Africans to do the same thing, to come to Victoria Falls, come to Great Zimbabwe or any other tourist attraction in Zimbabwe without having to fight each other over issues that are mainly economic. I understand and I get the argument about Pan-Africanism, but I think that argument is disingenuous if it's not rooted in economics. If the economics or the economic issues are addressed because they're foundational, I think we can have a Pan-African debate, and it won't just be a debate. It will actually happen because we will have balanced economies. So as long as we don't address the issues, the pull factors that are making Zimbabweans see South Africa as an attractive destination, whether you're documented or not, we won't be able to resolve the crisis that we are faced with today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hopewell. And that's the question I want to put to Brian Kagoro. Brian, you are a solid intellectual and glad to have you here in this particular conversation. Thank you so much for finding time for us. Hopewell talks of leadership failures, and there are those also who talk of having governments that fail to deliver services, critical services to the people. Of course, there are those who will argue that not necessarily those who leave Kenya go to Tanzania, or those who leave Zimbabwe go to South Africa. It is about looking for opportunities. Perhaps some of them have business enterprises and investment opportunities that they are carrying outside there. But in the issue of leadership failures, do you genuinely believe as an intellectual that this could be one of the reasons that driving what we are seeing, this negative attitudes and perceptions towards outsiders?
No. And it's not the economy either. We are at risk of having a very false conversation. Thank you to you and Tendai for having me here. The attitude towards foreigners in South Africa did not start after the Zimbabwean economy went belly up. Just do discipline ourselves and do a little bit of research of the incidents that happened in the hostels during the Wenela moment that Hopewell and others referred to. There were clashes and the foreignization of people. That is why the apartheid regime, as part of its divisive politics, adopted four approaches in order to neutralize the collective labor of South Africans who were unionized. It brought in Mozambican, Southern Rhodesian, and Malawian labor, and to some extent Namibian, Lesotho, and Botswana labor. That labor was not only deemed cheap, but because it could not be unionized and it was not fully documented, it enabled the apartheid state to contain labor as a source of black agitation for the liberation of South Africa. And within the hostels themselves, you had these clashes that happened between Zulus and other people, but also between South Africans and foreigners. It's documented. There's a lot of scholarship on that. So that otherization as a construct, that otherization, that xenophobic approach, that notion that those who are from elsewhere or who are different are the cause of the problem, is an integral part of the political economy of both the apartheid state and the post-apartheid state. In fact, one of the things I did when I joined the United Nations is they had a security briefing. If Sipho Sami Malunga and others were here, they'll tell you, because they worked for the United Nations, that said, it was all peaceful until in the late 1970s. First, the problem was seen as black people being allowed into suburbs or near suburbs. Then the second, it was foreigners being allowed, right? That's the first thing. So we need to understand the essence of the challenge of otherization is the politics of identity weaponized by apartheid capital before and components of post-apartheid capital to do three things: exploit black labor, divide black labor, and to avoid unionization, which would increase the cost of the exploitation and also extraction. And then you had something which is fairly interesting. Hopewell knows, because I've said this on one of his platforms before. The gentleman Elvis Nyati, by his surname and name, would be Ndebele. If you go into South African history, between 1823 and 1837, the king of the Transvaal, of the area called Johannesburg now, or Gauteng, was someone called Mzilikazi kaMachobana. Mzilikazi kaMachobana is the same Mzilikazi who later died in Zimbabwe, having founded the Mtwagazi Kingdom, or Ndebele Kingdom in Zimbabwe. Elvis kaMachobana is, according to Operation Tutula, a foreigner. But a white who came through Jan van Rensburg and Paul Kruger is considered a national. So Elvis, whose ancestor was king of Johannesburg, or Gauteng, is killed in Gauteng. On what basis? Operation Tutula says he's a foreigner. And that is the most splendid thing. It's like suggesting in the next 50 or 100 years that someone who's a grandchild of King Goodwill Zwelithini is a foreigner. And then someone who has come as an investor from Britain is documented. And therefore, Elvis, who's come back to his ancestral home, is undocumented. This is not just an argument about economy. This is an argument about how we've been taught a deconstructed, distorted history. So this is not just about romantic Pan-Africanism. This is about realism. Because we may end up, when we follow the migration of our own peoples, with everyone as an outsider. So which of the South Africans belong in Transvaal or in what is now Gauteng? Is a Zulu person who's come from KZN more South African than anybody else? I think that's the first point. The second point is what Wole said. So if you see, when you render labor and you are not paid, as the gentleman from Operation Tutula said, you are paying tax, because it essentially means the extractive nature of capital, which capital nourishes your tax system by not paying labor that it deems foreign, right? It is on the sweat of the backs of black people, whether those black people are Zimbabwean, Basutus, or Nigerians, that this capital is nourishing and building shopping malls and etc. That's one. Number two, the point Wole makes about the bulk of South Africa's top 15 corporates, which account for more than 60% of the taxation paid in South Africa. They are earning, whether it's Standard Bank, MTN, etc., they earn at least now more than 60% of their income outside of South Africa. They earn it in the same countries that you're saying are coming to grab your jobs. If you just go on Google right now as I speak, and you look at MTN 2021 earnings by country, you will realize the 3 billion in South Africa, 3 billion in Nigeria, and in the rest of Africa, it's about the same amount if you aggregate the figures. SAB Miller and etc. So the integration that you're seeing in the economy and in the capital that sustains the South African economy, because the tax to GDP ratio in South Africa is 26%. That means for all good intentions, all those so-called undocumented laborers who are not paid, and all the hardworking South Africans, the taxation they contribute is only 26% of the wealth of this nation. In essence, the point I see is not a matter of whether documented or not documented. In fact, ECOWAS has taught us the following. If it were easy to enter and leave South Africa, most of the people who end up settled here would leave, right? They would come here, do what they have to do, and go. In ECOWAS, they feared in 1977 when they did the treaty on the ECOWAS treaty, which has the right of establishment, the right of the freedom of movement, and etc., that the bigger economies like Nigeria, like Ghana, will end up with a migrant problem, because it's not possible to be illegal, and the problem of documentation is linked to the old immigration laws that saw black people as a security threat and therefore securitized immigration and made it almost impossible to travel and to enter countries. So even as a high-end professional, right, what it takes to enter and leave certain countries, including countries like Zimbabwe, is unacceptable. What the apartheid system did, comrades, was to limit the mobility of black labor, not only limit it physically, but also limit it socially, economically, and sometimes intellectually through what became Bantu education. That limitation of black labor essentially meant that because you are immobile, you are threatened by other low-end workers, right? So if you look at this xenophobia, you've seen this operation stopping people at the border who are truck drivers. No, not undocumented immigrants who are settled in Tembisa and Katlehong or somewhere else. These are people who are driving through the country doing deliveries that have been stopped, some of their trucks burnt. But where is there a high number per capita of undocumented folk? There are many Europeans in this country, as we learned in the Kreischer trial in South Africa a couple of years ago. Eastern Europeans and others were not documented. The idea that undocumented itself is a description of blackness, and that within the category of blackness is a description of proximity, is itself problematic. Right? It's problematic at several levels. Level number one, I don't think the bulk of the migration that happened into South Africa actually didn't happen, Hopewell and others, didn't happen after the Zimbabwean economic crisis. People forget that a lot of the people you call undocumented actually moved here in the 80s as a result of Gukurahundi. When there was a genocidal act in Matabeleland, that meant a lot of young people fleeing from parts of Matabeleland came into South Africa as part of survival. The second phase post-2000 as a result of the economic crisis actually is comparable in terms of the numbers. So what is it that needs to be fixed? You asked the question, are there South Africans who are in Zimbabwe? Yes, there are. Actually, not all of them were documented in the classics case that everybody talks about. The first community of South Africans were the first community of blacks to get title to land in what is called the Fingo location on Mbembezi. They'd come as interpreters for white colonialists. And that's why Xhosa is a national language in Zimbabwe. Right. So when we study the integration of our history and the implication of colonial patterns of migration and definition of our borders in this, and we study the limitations, the South African economy without the SADC economy actually is an anachronism. The South African economy would not go very far. If you locked out South Africa out of Nigeria and out of the SADC, it would basically collapse. So the collapse that faces the South African economy is not so much the collapse of caring for folks who are from other countries. It is the idea that South African capital, which is making super profits in the rest of the continent, including from Zimbabwe, actually, South African mining companies, South African retail companies, South African banking companies, if you lock them out of those dollar-earning economies, the condition of South African labor would be a lot worse off. The condition of South African service would be a lot worse off. You know, in the old days of the left, we used to say, workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. The very fact that you don't have this collective class consciousness that is actually saying, what is happening globally? You are seeing this in Europe, you're seeing this in America, you're seeing it elsewhere, is that as super profits become possible without companies confining themselves to state borders, the condition of workers who are confined to state borders in the context of production that can happen in 15 different countries at the same time and also happen virtually as well, let's say it, is that there is a real threat to labor. And that real threat to labor is that if you have only partly unionized labor in only parts of the countries, and if you have this fragmentation and division amongst workers across different countries, and they are not able to do what business is able to, which is collectively make decisions, in a context where we are told by Oxfam that in the world, only 8% of the world controls 92% of the wealth. That 1% or that 8% controls the bulk of the wealth. In a South Africa where black capital controls less than 8% of the wealth on the Joburg Stock Exchange, the fight amongst South African blacks with their Zimbabwean cousins over displacement within social service provisioning, which is dependent largely on what capital provides, seems to me, as Hopewell rightly said, to be missing the structural dimension of this. So I would end by saying the risk of a false conversation is this: even if you fixed all our economies tomorrow, our economies have become non-viable if imagined in statist terms. Even if you fixed and all our hospitals were functional, the mobility of labor is now dependent. You are talking as a Kenyan, you know this, right? Kenya has a fairly functional economy in many terms, but Kenya has high levels of migration of expertise. Why? In the post-pandemic phase, the United Kingdom is trying to attract all the best Kenyan doctors, Zimbabwean doctors, nurses, and even people who pack things in supermarkets, which is skilled and semi-skilled laborers. What will that mean for our economies, their survival, their functionalities, and our ability, the ability to provide services, not just having infrastructure, is having the skills to do so? What will this mean when our education systems are not churning enough of the professionals we need? Or when we do, they are being attracted by more developed nations in the context of their post-COVID or post-Brexit recovery? I'd like us maybe to think in a very thorough way and say a global phenomenon of xenophobia in certain contexts is out and out racism, which is what Le Pen says is the fear of racial dilution. In other contexts, it may be an expression of muted blackness, where people have been taught historically that when, as a black person, you face a threat, the witch or the wizard is the other black person, and you don't look at the role of big capital and how capital is reconfiguring itself as new power and how it is decimating labor. And the third may be a class warfare in which the different classes, those who control wealth, are better organized, and they control means of communication and are able to cause you to get divided because you look at the lowest common denominator, right? And if we went beyond that, I think we might have liberation for African workers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was quite an eye-opener. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, before I bring in Tendai, allow me to once again request you to follow each other.
Solutions. I wanted to go just to Brian. Brian, if we were to ask you to come up with a 5-point plan in terms of tackling the growing issue of xenophobia, what would you suggest?
I think number one, deal with questions of accountability for criminality. It is not the business of Dudula to enforce law because they neither have the mandate to arrest nor the mandate to do what they are doing. That means the South African government must take a responsibility and accountability for what happens in terms of handling of immigration. Now, this means that there needs to be a fundamental and radical shift in that thinking. In the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, freedom of movement, right of residence, and right of establishment fundamentally changes what Motsoaledi, the South African minister, announced, because what he announced as the new immigration policy is inconsistent. So South Africa has to determine whether they want to be in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is actually led by a South African, and if so, whether they ascribe to the freedom of movement, right of residence, and rights, of establishment. The second is a matter of dealing with the implications on access to social services. I think social services are accessible by citizens and certain rights of citizens. And in South Africa, as in most of the countries in Africa, the problem has been the lack of health insurance for citizens and for ordinary folk. So why you end up with folks who are undocumented displacing in the queue folks who are nationals is that lack of a systemic or systematic approach. So the idea is not whether or not those who are present in the territory of South Africa and are able to pay should be able to access, but the question is who has the right to access services free of cost or with the subsidy that the state offers. And I think that's a matter of both policy and practice. But there is a third element to it. The third element to it is, I think Pan-Africanism is not a luxury. Pan-Africanism is realizing that we are now becoming an economic minority collectively as Black people in our own continent. As other nationalities take an interest in our mineral resources, in our tourist ventures, and through foreign direct investment and the opportunities that are offered by the vast amounts of land and other things that we have, is that Africans risk becoming slaves in a different era, in that fragmented, we were colonized first, not because we were culturally inferior. We were colonized because we were divided. We were colonized because technologically, those who colonized us were more advanced. That's why it will be a few hundred or thousand white men that colonized most of our countries, right? And I would say unity is first a political choice. But you cannot arrive at unity without understanding it yourselves culturally. What colonialism did was to make us not understand the continent and to view each other the same way that the colonial regimes did, that any Black life, any Black body is a threat, a nuisance, and a danger. So where there are diseases, they associate them with Black people. Where there's crime, with Black people. Where there's poverty, with Black people. So the solution is actually addressing this disemboweling of the Black humanity and Black soul, this fragmentation of Black logic that begins to see first, not those who are coming to take away our gold and diamonds as the threat, but those who are coming to work in restaurants and to clean as the threat, not the capital that employs them without paying them salaries. Addressing that exploitative nature of capital as opposed to the exploited labor is the beginning, because if capital is censored, and that means the opportunity that we are complaining of will not. So the state as well as capital have a responsibility. That means there needs to be a consensus with business or the private sector and the state in South Africa around how to deal with this particular problem. But the media, I think that we cannot address xenophobia without addressing the media. I have been so exasperated by how the media, in reference to any crime committed, decides to do what the apartheid regime used to do, a black person. So you behave as though crime of necessity is tied to identity, so that the more the media repeats this linking of crime to identity, you begin to associate crime with blackness, or crime with Zimbabweanness, or crime with Nigerianness. And this is not to say there are no Nigerians or Zimbabweans who commit crime. But on average, if you are in South Africa, you go to the prisons, you go to where crime. There will be more locals that commit crime than there are non-locals. It is just understanding that if you say there are X number of I don't call them foreigners, because the idea of being a black foreigner itself doesn't sit well with me. Many liberation movement folk, South Africans, did not have passports. In fact, they were undocumented when they lived in Zimbabwe. And some who lived in our house, my family's house. So I don't, this undocumented thing is something that I struggle with. I think that the reason why it even arises is because the regime of immigration governance, based on the fiction that statist solutions of necessity comport with thinking about modern economies that have become digital, financialized, and globalized. It seems to me somewhat strange. So I would say deal with the question of freedom of movement and make it unnecessary for those who go past the stringent movement restrictions to cheat the system, so that people can move freely in and out. And then those who get the right of establishment, there are categories. You can be established for 3 months, for 4 months, for permanency, and so on and so forth. And I think that South Africans need, including semi-skilled South Africans, need to realize that in the next 5 to 10 years, the greatest opportunity for jobs, for their own welfare, will be in their neighboring countries. Because as you have this Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and as our borders become more accessible to capital from elsewhere, a political defense will not suffice. As statist, there will be no Operation Dudula which will stop more globalized, financialized, and digitalized economies. But what will happen as a result of that digitalization of what we do, whether it's healthcare and etc., is that we're going to have more and more black folk in South Africa being unemployed. And it is not in the interest of South Africa's neighbors that black bodies in South Africa be unemployed or not have opportunities. What actually we ought to accept, the same way that now when you go to Mozambique and you have a lot of young white South Africans who are investing there, who are settling there, and etc., that opportunity should be accorded by SADC governments to black South Africans who can render service, render labor, have employment. And I think that one-way movement of people into South Africa doesn't make sense to me, because, in the same Zimbabwe where people are not finding opportunities, those who have access to capital. Why don't Zimbabweans have access to capital? Those South Africans who have access to capital, middle class, lower class, who can get enabled by the South African state to become entrepreneurs, investors, and who can, through application of their potential ingenuity and their skills, settle in Mozambique, in other countries. I think that once we have that secular sort of economy for labor in SADC, the labor migration in the region will not be unidirectional, but the benefits of entrepreneurship will be multipolar. It will be for South Africans as it is for other people. The hostility is not just to undocumented migrants. And I didn't have time to talk about the hostility I face when I'm being interviewed at the South African entry ports, when I'm being treated by South African police, even an occasional stop at a roadblock. And I think that I'm always surprised when I find courteous South African police officers who treat me like a human being. Because there are others who actually treat me like I am a criminal by mere fact that I am not South African. And for a country that wants to promote investment and etc., that's not good. That extremity between how our South African brothers and sisters feel and the reality that we talked about of structural challenges that South Africa will face, is facing, that some of our other countries have faced, that go beyond governance, right? Because sometimes we will say that it's only a question of governance. If you look at the challenge of the structure of our economies and their foreign ownership and minority ownership, the same problems that you had in Zimbabwe, that you had in Mozambique, that you had elsewhere, will arise in South Africa. They will arise because distribution and redistribution in the economy is still at very low levels. And that is why the idea or notion that, no, the problem is not that structural challenge, it's a foreign invasion by foreign undocumented laborers, becomes more appealing, because we always punch those who are weaker because they're more accessible than this big, inaccessible power that has control over our economy and over our politics, whether you call it WMC or you call it something else. Lastly, I think we can't change narrative without data and knowledge. So, for example, as we sit now, if you look at the only statistics we have suggest that there are 640,000 odd Zimbabweans in South Africa, right? And we're talking about potentially the undocumented. But Stats SA says, well, we don't know for sure. But if you talk about foreign African nationals in South Africa, it's about 4 million. Now, 4 million out of 54 million may not be a lot. The question that I think Operation Tudula and others are raising is, where do you feel this? You feel it in low-cost housing. You feel this presence in low-income jobs. You feel this presence in low-income inaccessibility or accessible services. And if that is the problem, then there must be an obligation on part of the South African state and its neighbors to resolve that. But because I've already said business doesn't pay most of this low-cost foreign workers, does not make any tax deductions. If it does, it can't if they're not documented, right? It essentially means business must come to the party in addressing the question of service delivery. And the last thing is linked to data, is I think academics, scholars must begin to look at this issue and not give this simplistic answers that the issue is poor service delivery. Surely there's poor service delivery in Congo. In fact, there are more refugees, there are more foreigners in Uganda and Kenya and Ethiopia than there are in South Africa. And we don't have the levels of xenophobic attacks against foreigners that we do here in South Africa. So the issue is not about volume. It's not even about strain on services. It's about mindsets and how media or how public narratives that are deployed talk about this. So I'd say it's stop making excuses for murderous, Afrophobic behavior, but also stop making excuses for governments, the South African one and its neighboring governments, that actually don't take responsibility for the social and political factors that perhaps in part sustain xenophobia.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to come back to you and all our panelists, and Hopewell, I'm coming back with this question to you after going to the floor. I'm going to ask you a question about, is there a thin line between shining a spotlight on the governance lapses that a country is experiencing and possibly promoting, a negative stereotype about it? And I'm asking you that specific question because I saw you pushing back this week because you were under siege by some people who possibly were accusing you of promoting a negative narrative about your own country of origin, and whether that was also contributing to some of the international negative imaging that Zimbabwe was facing in general. But I'll come back to you on that because I need to go down to
won't follow you right back. and let's keep in touch with our brothers and sisters. Go ahead, Brian.
Thank you, Ken and Tendai, and many thanks to my South African brothers and sisters. My family, I lost my eldest brother in the service of the liberation of South Africa. So my family has a very strong and personal attachment to South Africa, its liberation and its development. And I think that what I'm going to say should not therefore pain you. It's truth, since we said we're speaking about truth. There is only a part truth to the idea that we will solve what we face by solving the governance of each of our countries. South Africans, yes, do protest, do a lot of amazing struggle things, but corruption has deepened even as South Africans protest. Service delivery has dilapidated. The economy has declined. And not because simply that there's been a strain caused by the non-South African Africans, but because of the factors that I think Morphu spoke about. So I would like us, as we agree that there is a role to be played with solving governance, also pay attention to, I think it is Hopewell who referred to them as structural issues. And in particular, somebody asked, why do Zimbabweans say South Africa is part of the problem in Zimbabwe? Zimbabweans had managed through an electoral process to almost vote out a regime that had been oppressing them. It is South Africa which had the final say in whether or not that election was free, fair, and credible, that actually coined a term that did not exist before in electoral nomenclature, that the election was unfair, but the result credibly reflected the will of the people. That's how Mugabe managed his first coup in 2000, and that's how we ended up in 2008 with the second coup, and 2018 with the third coup. And in each of those moments, South Africa was called upon by those who were beneficiaries to come and bless that particular occasion. And the South African approach was based on the fear that the opposition coming from Labour might represent what they'd seen in Zambia with Chiluba, a proxy regime that was a Washington project. And therefore, the political decision made by South Africa was in response to what they saw as meddling by the West and their fear of what they saw as a non-progressive opposition. That does not absolve us as Zimbabweans for continuing the fight for the liberation of our country, but it's just a clarion call to South Africa that next time, when we've gone through an electoral process where the preponderance of evidence suggests that it's been stolen, please don't come and bless the rape of the people's will, and don't allow your government to. Otherwise, this all translates into a problem on your doorstep. Which takes me to a very interesting point. Thank you, Maynard. I quite found your input entertaining, but if you don't mind my saying so, perhaps misplaced. There is a difference between, you kept on jumping between refugees, asylum seekers, and illegal immigrants. Those are very different legal categories. A refugee, once granted that status, or an asylee or asylum seeker, is not an illegal immigrant. But once a person has been denied refugee status and they continue to abide in a country, then that continued residence without that status makes them an illegal immigrant. Illegal immigrants largely refer to people who enter the country without a work permit, or who have a temporary permit to do business for 30 days and then extend without legal permission, or who don't even use that channel, who cross through informal means or through fraudulent means and then stay on in the country. Now, part of the challenge with Operation Tutula and some of the operations that are not Tutula that have been going to restaurants, going elsewhere, is that the fine line between those people who hold permits that are going to expire or who hold particular permits and the notion that even for those who hold permits, there is an overemployment of non-South Africans within certain sectors, even non-South Africans that are actually legally in the country and hold permits, especially in those semi-skilled or low-skilled jobs, which essentially means this conversation about xenophobia goes beyond what Operation Tutula has been telling us there about, which is illegal immigration. That actually there is, and this is what Mofu and I were trying to say when we were talking about the economy, the labor economy, labor migration, labor capital relationship, state labor capital relationship. Because what it essentially means is even if every other person from Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique who doesn't have a permit leaves, and you only remain with those who have permits, the problem, given the levels of unemployment in South Africa, especially in certain sectors, is that even non-nationals who have permits might be one too many. And that therefore the hostility towards them is not based purely on them having or not having the rightful papers to stay in the country. It's the idea that of the displacement factor within that labor market. I think Mofu did a brilliant job of pointing us towards the contradictions in the labor market, the future trajectory of the labor market. But there is a third point, which is the criminality and criminalization of foreignhood. What is that? There are foreigners, foreign nationals that are engaged in crime. And those foreign nationals that engage in crime indeed must be dealt with according to the law. And those foreign nationals who don't engage in crime in South Africa must join the effort of fighting against crime in their neighborhoods and in South Africa, and also ensuring that they don't take any actions that retain people who tarnish the good relations between Africans, especially from South Africa and elsewhere. But that's quite separate from the criminalization of foreignness, in the sense that why the reference by Tendai to Rwanda is apt, Ken, for this conversation is stigmatization leads ultimately to sub and unintended criminalization. So that amongst the discerning, like my brother from Operation Tutula, who spoke quite eloquently, he may make the fine distinctions between a legal foreigner or a legal non-South African resident, but there are others for whom this problem is in pure and simple terms. What is the problem? The problem is a non-South African national. Why do we call it Afrophobia and not xenophobia? Xenophobia is the ill feelings towards persons who are foreigners. The extent of ill feelings demonstrated, whether through Operation Tutula or any other, towards white and other non-national foreigners who actually, according to South African statistics, are in this country without proper papers, has been very low in comparison to the targeting of persons who are Black and African. So in essence, it ceases just to be xenophobia, which is all foreigners who don't have the right papers, no matter their race, no matter their class, must be targeted. All foreigners who engage in crime, no matter their race, no matter their class, must be targeted by the operation. when it largely manifests both in its public portrayal and media portrayal as going to a particular class of people or particular race of people, whether or not it's a global phenomenon, because it's happening in the US against migrants from Latin America or in Brexit, it assumes a particular. So in the US, it's racism against people of color, racism against black migrants and African migrants and Arab migrants, which has led to Islamophobia, which has led to, institutionalized racism. Many South Africans may not appreciate this, and I'll end with this. So whilst you have very benign concerns by community activists like my brother from Operation Tutula and my sister, who eloquently spoke about us actually looking at the positive and the negative, many bona fide non-South African nationals who actually have permits are subjected to institutionalized xenophobic treatment. And when you look at all of this, then you ask a simple question. It's not about whether or not Botswana shouldn't be criticized. South Africa is held to much higher standards, as must Zimbabwe, for two reasons, and Namibia. These countries went through a deep history of racist discrimination by an institutionalized white minority. In Zimbabwe, it was Rhodesia. In South Africa and Zimbabwe, the crime was an international crime, the racism that ruled. Both countries went through deep series of trauma, and often we speak as though only one went through trauma. Zimbabwe had to fight an active 15-year bush war in which thousands perished, and post-independence, as a result of destabilization from the apartheid regime, sponsoring Inamo to the east and Super ZAPU, Zimbabwe also, through its own genocidal acts, through its own government, went through Gukurahundi, right? So our societies have a problem of collective violence and institutionalized trauma. And the decision we are making in having these conversations is really not about guilt shifting, where it's simply reminding ourselves that these differences, whatever they are, and these tensions must not translate into black on black violence, and in particular, the burning of lives. And my brother from Operation Tutula was quite correct. In 2008, 2014, 2019, the horrendous acts of violence were not simply about we're sick and tired, so go. They were not simply about police come and take these ones, they're here illegally. They're about the deepest form of dehumanization, which finds its equivalence in how folks treated each other or were treated by the apartheid regime. Now, it's not just a South African problem, it's a collective problem. Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Lesotho must deal with their economic problems, with their governance problems. But the geopolitical factors that will make South Africa to be downgraded 4 times, right? That will punish the South African government for trying to distribute and redistribute in the economy, this radical economic policy. Those international factors that will punish South Africa for daring to empower Black South Africans must be our collective focus as a group of Black people. So I'll end in saying xenophobia that we're seeing in the world reflects 4 contradictions. Contradictions of a global economy that has grown wealth for a minority and excluded the majority. Contradictions of a state or state systems of governance that for security and management of power have become conveniences, but they are unable to deliver service and humanity to their citizens. 3, contradictions of societies that are becoming increasingly militarized and digitalized, where states and corporates can keep surveillance over citizens, right? But citizens are unable to connect at a human level beyond these contestations around deprivation. But number 4, contradictions of society in which hope is fast dissipating, and we don't know where else to turn in order to get decent lives. We go to schools, get education, and South Africans shouldn't bear the burden for the rest of the continent. The collective
Thank
struggle
you.
by all Africans should be the Pan-Africanist struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you so much, Brian Kagoro. It was glad having you here. Let me pick behave that way because we've just had a good conversation here. Let me take
Sorry, Kenneth. I don't know whether I saw my DM. I need to step off because I've got a plane to
finish.
catch.
Okay, please
So can I just
briefly,
round off?
Hopewell.
Yeah.
Okay.
No. Thanks a lot, Kennedy, for a very informative discussion. I've been listening, and I was more interested in listening to South Africans tonight because you can't come up with solutions if you're not listening to what your hosts are saying, and in this case, our hosts are South Africans. I've heard a few things that have been put on the table. I want to look at the solutions, and one of the solutions was tight border security. That does not work. Regardless of how much money South Africa pours into border security, it becomes a revolving door. We've seen that for decades. If people are deported, they will find a way back in, and that has been proven by so many studies that it's a revolving door. Then we must also understand that there are different levels of this discussion. There's the elitist level where people are pontificating over issues, drinking expensive whiskey. And in most cases, those people are not affected, and they do not understand the pain of the day-to-day pain of the immigrant coming from Zimbabwe or any other country, and the pain of the South Africans who are saying, listen to us, we've got a problem. It's easier to speak, in giving solutions that might not necessarily work. And then there's the issue of leadership. SADC is moribund. We know that these things have been going on since 2008, and SADC has failed to do anything. In fact, you would have expected SADC to speak about what's happening right now, but SADC is as good as dead. They're not interested in addressing this issue in a holistic manner. Then the fourth issue is Pan-Africanism. My personal view, is I hear all those intellectual debates, but they're rhetoric to me because they don't address the elephant in the room. The real issue for me, Kennedy, is the economic issues that are the pull factors for Zimbabweans and other Africans to go to South Africa. So we need to look at what the South Africans have put at the table. They've said social services. They've said hospitals. They've said their hospitals have been overrun. And we've heard their Home Affairs Minister saying that, for instance, 75% of women giving birth at Musina Hospital are from Zimbabwe. So the solutions are that Zimbabwe must fix its hospitals. As I've always said, Kennedy, this time and time again, the biggest hospital in Zimbabwe, Salim Gabe Hospital, has got only one maternity theater that is working. And it was built...
Kennedy, you should not allow this. This is flawed. And these are the dangerous minds. He's taking advantage of a situation.
I think you should remove him, Kennedy, because
it's only fair. It's only fair. We are not.
But you cannot lie about things that are not truthful.
What is not truthful?
Hope will continue.
I think you should not allow these clowns to come and mess up an otherwise decent discussion that we are having. They can do their ZANU-PF propaganda elsewhere, Kennedy, not to come and discuss and disturb a conversation that is rooted in facts. And we should not allow propagandists to come and disturb these conversations. It's not good. But anyway, as I was saying, it is a fact that the public hospital, the biggest public hospital in Zimbabwe, has got only one theater, which was built in 1977. It's a fact that is in a state newspaper. In fact, the only theater that is working there was refurbished by a bank called Stanbic. And the state has told us that to fix this theater, it costs 37,000 US dollars. That's one theater. So to fix 10 theater, to have 10 theaters, it costs 370,000. To have 100 theaters, it costs only 3.7 million. So if you were to build 100 theaters today in Zimbabwe for 3.7 million, pay the nurses and doctors proper wages, it will reduce the number of people that go to South Africa seeking these maternity services, because it's human nature that if you don't have access to good healthcare, you're going to seek it elsewhere. Whether you go in legally or not, they're still going to go. What we need to avoid is this kind of propagandists that come and cloud the discussions, trying to push partisan narratives instead of dealing with the problem for what it is and coming up with a solution. It is a fact again that the government of Zimbabwe has said 100 million US dollars worth of gold is being smuggled. You know, Canada went to jail because I exposed one of those people who was going to be given a corrupt judicial decision. And 100 million US dollars will fix most of our problems. And when as Zimbabwean, you had somebody who was on this space saying that Zimbabweans are coming to South Africa to seek cancer services. You heard me again last week, Kennedy, talking about how the whole country, the public health system in Zimbabwe, the whole of it, does not have a single working cancer machine. ZANU propagandists don't want to hear this, but we need to say it because that's the truth. We cannot be governed by propaganda and lies. Because propaganda and lies, Kennedy, is what has created this crisis. So we need to define what the problems are in order to come up with the solutions. Sure. If we could buy 10 cancer machines, it would cost only 20 million US dollars to do that, and would not have to fight with South Africans over their health delivery system. So I think it's important for us to start naming what the problems are and defining what the solutions are. And let's start with the basic things, not the intellectual stuff of Pan-Africanism and all that. Let's start with the practical things that will bring relief. If you were to ask the South Africans that are on this call tonight and say, what are your immediate problems with foreign nationals who are not documented that you would like to get resolved? That's a good starting point. Ask them what the problems are. And if they tell you that we are fighting over health services, as the other brother said, then we need to address that. We can expound about global capital and all those fancy things, but they don't resolve the issue in Soweto today of health services that are being contested for. If you listened to what the health minister of South Africa was saying the other time, he said we get a budget for, let's say, 30,000 people living in a community. But that budget is overrun because there are people that are there that are not documented. South Africa has got a policy, like many other countries, that when someone presents themselves at a hospital and they require medical services, they must be given those medical services, whether they're documented or not. And so as Africans, we should not lie to ourselves about what our problems are. We should say these are the problems. We cannot talk about the sanctions propaganda, Kennedy, if we are going to be honest in what we want to achieve as Africans. Sanctions do not stop Zimbabwe from allocating finances to buy cancer machines. And indeed, that issue came up in Zimbabwean parliament yesterday. And the finance minister said, yes, I have the money. It's recorded in the Zimbabwean parliament, Hansard, that the money is there. So let's not waste time pushing these party political propaganda of sanctions. Let's deal with the issues. If the finance minister is saying the money is there, then why are we not buying these cancer machines? Because if we buy them today, Kennedy, it will help us resolve the issues that we are having with South Africans.
Okay.
I don't think it's wise for us, specifically as Zimbabweans, to continue telling South Africans how to run their country. I'll round off by saying, when you are in a marriage and you are having a fight with your wife or your husband, it is important to also listen to your spouse and hear what their problems are. Try to address them, and you will see that your marriage will become successful. So in this case, we need to listen to what the South Africans are saying and then try to address some of the problems that can be addressed immediately, especially about social services in Zimbabwe. And then we start working on our economy, building our politics to become better, and we can create a better economy. We can't lecture to South Africans that you've got these problems of white people, this and that. Let them solve their problems with their white people, with their racism and all that. We need to solve our problems so that we don't add on top of what they have. Thanks, Kennedy.
Thank you so much, Hopewell. And of course, we must add here, South Africans have reserved the right of admission. Just like some others, just like